Welcome back to Executive Protection Insights. I'm Liam, your host. There's something I've noticed over the years working around family office environments. The way people think about risk is often slightly off, and that's understanding travel risk. Because when you really step back and look at where risk actually exists in this world, it's not where most people think. It's not inside the residence. It's not in the office. It happens in movement. It happens in transition. And more often than not, it happens during travel. This is something I've seen very directly in my own experience. I was fortunate to spend time inside a very large family office, where I was responsible for managing the family's travel operations. And what I want to share with you here doesn't come from theory or best practices on paper. It comes from being in that position where you are responsible for moving a family across countries, across environments, sometimes across continents, and doing it in a way that is safe, controlled, and at the same time completely seamless for them. Because that's the expectation at that level. They don't want to feel the complexity, but you still have to manage it. And this is also where one of the biggest differences with corporate environments becomes very clear. In a corporate setting, you are usually focused on one principle, one agenda, one structured movement. In a family office environment, that is rarely the case. Now you have the spouse, you have the children, sometimes you have grandparents, and very often they all have different plans, different destinations, different schedules. So instead of managing one movement, you are suddenly managing multiple movements at the same time. And you have to make decisions on how to split your team. Who goes where? What level of coverage is required? What level of risk is acceptable in each situation? And you're making those decisions in environments you don't fully control and sometimes don't fully know, which adds another layer of complexity. Because now it's not just about protecting movement. It's about prioritizing protection across multiple simultaneous movements. What makes family office travel particularly challenging is that it doesn't follow a predictable pattern. It's rarely linear. Plans change, schedules shift, destinations evolve. One moment you're planning a private flight to one location, and a few hours later that plan is adjusted, extended, or redirected. And within a very short window, you're dealing with multiple environments, different countries, different infrastructures, different levels of risk. So if you approach this from a traditional security perspective, where you think in terms of fixed locations and controlled environments, you miss the real picture. Because the risk is not sitting in one place. It's moving with the principle. And it becomes most visible in the moments in between. Take aviation, for example. On the surface, especially with private aviation, it feels controlled. You're dealing with private terminals, smaller environments, limited access. And it's easy to assume that this is one of the safer parts of the journey. But in reality, the exposure often sits around the edges of that experience. It's in the arrival at the FBO. It's in how the vehicle is positioned. It's in the timing of movements, the visibility of the principal, who is present, who is observing. These are subtle factors, but they matter. And when you move into commercial aviation, the environment changes completely. Now you're dealing with crowds, unpredictability, proximity to unknown individuals. You're moving through check-in areas, security lines, boarding gates, spaces where you don't control who is around you. And again, the critical moments are not static, they are in motion. Moving from one space to another, navigating through environments that you don't control, then you arrive at the destination. And this is where I've seen many teams make a critical mistake. There's a tendency to relax, to feel like the difficult part is over. But in reality, the operation is just beginning. Hotels are a perfect example of this. They give the impression of structure and control. There's staff, there are systems, there are procedures, but fundamentally they are public environments. People are constantly coming and going. Access points are multiple. Visibility is high, and control is limited. So again, the risk doesn't sit in the room itself. It sits in movement, walking through a lobby, waiting for an elevator, entering or exiting a vehicle. Those small transitions, those are the moments that require the most attention. The same applies to private residences abroad. Villas, rental properties, temporary homes. They often feel comfortable, familiar, even secure. but they don't have the same infrastructure as a primary residence. And there is a tendency to assume safety without fully validating the environment. But if there's one area where risk becomes even more pronounced, it's road movement. This is where everything becomes fully exposed. You're in public space. You're visible. You're moving through an environment that you do not control, and you are relying on timing, coordination, and local conditions that can change at any moment. Traffic behaves differently depending on the country. Driving habits vary. Routes that look simple on paper become unpredictable in reality. And even a small disruption, a delay, a wrong turn, an unexpected stop, can create a moment of vulnerability. And that's the key. It's not the big, obvious threats that define most situations. It's the small disruptions. The moments where the plan doesn't unfold exactly as expected, because that's where exposure increases. This is why in travel security, preparation is essential, but it's not enough. Adaptability becomes just as important, because no matter how well you plan, reality will always introduce variables. And this is where planning, when done properly, becomes much deeper than a simple itinerary. It's not just about knowing where you're going. It's about understanding what happens if something goes wrong. If there is a medical emergency, do you actually know where the nearest private medical facility is? Not just a hospital, but a facility capable of handling a serious trauma, like a motor vehicle incident? Do you know how far it is, how long it takes to get there, and whether they can receive the principal immediately? Do you know where the embassy is? And not just the address, but how to reach it, how long it takes, and what support they can realistically provide in a crisis. If you're operating through private aviation, do you know if the FBO is accessible 24 hours a day, or are there restrictions? What happens if your timing shifts? What happens if you arrive outside of standard operating hours? And then there are customs and regulatory considerations. What are the local requirements? What documentation is needed? What could delay your movement? What could prevent a smooth transition? These are not theoretical questions. These are the kinds of details that determine whether an operation remains smooth or becomes complicated very quickly. And then there's another layer that often doesn't get enough attention: medical. Medical risk during travel is one of the most critical aspects of executive protection, precisely because it doesn't always present itself as a security issue, until suddenly it is. A medical incident in a foreign country, in transit, in a hotel, or even mid-flight changes everything instantly. Now you're dealing with unfamiliar healthcare systems, different standards of care, language barriers, response time uncertainties, and suddenly the situation becomes urgent, complex, and highly sensitive. So part of managing travel is not just about anticipating threats. It's about being prepared for events that are not intentional, but just as dangerous. Knowing where to go, knowing what resources are available, having options, having a plan that can be activated immediately. When you look at all of this together, aviation, hotels, residences, road movements, medical, and even the complexity of managing multiple family members with different agendas, a pattern becomes very clear. Risk is not concentrated, it's distributed across the journey, across time, across transitions. And more importantly, it intensifies in those in-between moments, moving from aircraft to vehicle, from vehicle to hotel, from hotel to event, and back again. These are the moments where coordination, timing, and awareness matter the most, and these are also the moments where things tend to break down if the operation is not properly structured. Because what I've seen repeatedly is not a lack of competence, it's fragmentation. Planning exists in one place, communication in another, intelligence somewhere else, tracking somewhere else. And when those elements are not connected, you lose continuity, you lose speed, you lose clarity. And in a travel environment, those losses are amplified because everything is happening faster. Decisions need to be made quicker. There is less margin for delay. So what becomes critical is not just planning, it's continuity. The ability to move from planning to execution to adaptation without friction. Because ultimately, the smoother the operation, the lower the exposure. And that's really the core idea. Travel security, especially in a family office context, is not about locking everything down. It's about managing movement, reducing friction, maintaining control without slowing the experience down. Because at that level, security is expected to be effective, but invisible. The principal should never feel the complexity behind it, but the team has to manage that complexity constantly. So if you're thinking about executive protection in a family office environment, don't start with locations. Don't start with static checklists. Start with movement. Start with transitions. Start with understanding where things can go wrong in between, because that's where most risks actually happen. I'm Liam, and this was Executive Protection Insights.